When people talk about nations, about governments and leaders and treaties, they often speak as though these things exist in some abstract realm, floating above the rest of us, immune to the messiness of individual human behavior. That's a dangerous illusion. Nations are not some ethereal entity, they are simply networks of individuals bound together by rules, agreements, and trust. And every single one of those agreements is upheld or undermined by individual choices. We want to believe that the system is strong enough to withstand the bad actions of a single person. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not. There are moments in history when one person, one corrupt act, one betrayal, one lie, alters the trajectory of an entire geopolitical relationship. That's the sobering reality of responsibility at the individual level. The very structure of the world is fragile in the face of deliberate wrongdoing. Now, it's tempting to think that the responsibility to uphold these massive relationships belongs only to those at the top, prime ministers, presidents, ambassadors. But that's a mistake. In truth, the chain of responsibility runs all the way down to every citizen who interacts, directly or indirectly, with the machinery of state. You might be a low-level clerk, an engineer, a translator, or a private businessman, but the decisions you make can still shape the way two nations perceive each other. If you decide to cut corners, falsify information, or act purely in your own interest at the expense of the greater good, the consequences can cascade upward with startling speed. Systems amplify human action. The smallest misstep, if leveraged by the wrong circumstances, can explode into a diplomatic crisis. That is not hyperbole. It is a fact borne out repeatedly by history. We prefer stories where the villain is a faceless entity, the government, the system, the corporation, because that removes personal accountability. It's easier to rail against an abstract villain than to confront the reality that a single flawed human being, acting in self-interest, can topple a painstakingly built bridge between nations. And when such an act happens, the damage is rarely contained. It spreads through the fabric of mutual trust like a tear in cloth, widening with each attempt to patch it hastily. Once trust is broken between nations, it becomes a grueling, expensive, and politically dangerous process to restore it. That's why individual responsibility matters so deeply. Without it, even the strongest alliance is vulnerable to collapse. There is a paradox here. We underestimate our own importance when it comes to doing good, but we underestimate the damage we can do when we choose badly. One person working in the right way might believe their contribution is too small to matter, so they become passive. Meanwhile, one person acting destructively is often underestimated until it's too late. People will say, it's just one person, it can't possibly shift the course of history. But look at the record. History is filled with examples of lone actors, sometimes barely known to the public, whose reckless decisions triggered conflicts, soured alliances, and changed economic trajectories. That's the uncomfortable truth about power. It is not only concentrated in the visible positions, it exists in the choices made at every level of the chain. And the reason this happens, the reason one person's actions can have such a monumental impact, is because the world operates on an incredibly delicate balance of trust. Trust is slow to build and easy to destroy. It is the invisible currency of diplomacy, the unseen infrastructure of international cooperation. Without it, no treaty holds, no trade agreement lasts, and no alliance stands. If an individual betrays that trust, whether through corruption, dishonesty, negligence, or personal gain, they do more than damage their own reputation. They call into question the reliability of their entire nation in the eyes of the other. That's a heavy burden, and yet it's one that most people ignore until the damage is done. This is where personal morality becomes more than just a private matter. People like to think of morality as something confined to the personal sphere. You don't lie, you don't steal, you don't betray, because it's the right thing to do. But when you operate within structures as interconnected as international relations, Morality becomes a structural necessity. If you cheat, it's not just about you. You may undermine a supply chain, compromise a security protocol, or cause diplomatic retaliation. Morality is the maintenance of order. Without it, the very fabric of cooperative systems begins to unravel. And the frightening thing is, you might not even see the full consequences of your actions until long after they've been set in motion. Another dimension to consider is that individuals rarely act in a vacuum. When one person makes a destructive choice, it's often reinforced by a surrounding culture of permissiveness or short-term thinking. Maybe the organization they work in quietly rewards cutting corners. Maybe there's an unspoken understanding that self-interest comes first. This is how corruption metastasizes, not just through the willful act of one bad person, but through an environment that fails to challenge them. And yet, the public will still reduce the entire event to a single name, a single face. That's because we intuitively understand that one person is often the tipping point, even if the conditions for disaster were long in the making. When we dismiss the possibility that one person can cause enormous harm, we also blind ourselves to the possibility that one person can cause enormous good. The underlying principle is the same: individual choices matter far more than we are comfortable admitting. This is a deeply unsettling reality because it forces you to confront your own potential for both creation and destruction. It's easier to tell ourselves that the world's problems are out there, somewhere in the realm of grand politics, beyond our reach. But the truth is that you are entangled in it. Your integrity, or lack of it, is not a private matter. It is part of the architecture of the systems you inhabit. What's important to grasp is that the ripple effect of an individual decision is not linear. It's exponential. In a personal context, betraying someone's trust damages one relationship. In a geopolitical context, that same breach can set off a chain reaction, sparking suspicion, stalling negotiations, freezing trade, or even inciting retaliation. And once those ripples begin, they interact with countless other currents in unpredictable ways. That's why we see situations where a seemingly small or isolated incident escalates into a full-blown diplomatic rift. Complexity magnifies consequence. One moment of selfishness can metastasize into an international narrative of betrayal. Ultimately, the problem is that people don't see themselves as players in the grand narrative of history. They see themselves as spectators, as bystanders, as people whose actions exist in the shadows of real events. But history is not just written by leaders and generals. It is written by clerks, by traders, by mid-level managers, by translators, by engineers, by ordinary people whose choices set the stage for the events we later read about in textbooks. The illusion that you are too small to matter is one of the most dangerous beliefs you can hold, because it frees you from the responsibility to act with integrity. And when you are freed from that responsibility, you become capable, however unintentionally, of contributing to the very disasters you would claim to oppose. Truth is not optional if you want to build anything that lasts. It is not a matter of personal preference or a cultural quirk or a convenient political tool. It is the bedrock upon which trust is constructed, and without trust, there can be no meaningful cooperation between people, let alone between nations. Every treaty, every agreement, every alliance is essentially a shared promise, and a promise without truth is an illusion waiting to collapse. When you remove truth from the foundation, the structure still stands for a while, but it rots from within, and the collapse, when it comes, is sudden and devastating. This is why lies are not just morally wrong, but structurally destructive. You cannot lie and expect stability. You cannot manipulate reality and expect reality to work in your favor. And yet, people continue to gamble with this principle, thinking they can cheat the system without consequence. When two nations cooperate, it's not because they trust each other completely. That's a myth. It's because they trust the framework they've built together. And that framework is held together by the expectation of truthfulness in key matters. break that expectation, and the framework begins to shake. One deceptive act can cause the other side to question every piece of information, every assurance, every guarantee you have ever given. Once that suspicion sets in, every conversation becomes slower, every negotiation more cautious, every shared project more fragile. The flow of cooperation turns into a trickle, and eventually it may dry up altogether. That's what happens when truth is sacrificed. The gears of collaboration seize, and the machine stops working. It doesn't matter how sophisticated the arrangement is. Without truth, it's just a ticking clock counting down to collapse. What people often forget is that truth has a unique quality. It is self-reinforcing. When you tell the truth consistently, you build a reputation for reliability, and that reputation compounds over time. Nations, like individuals, invest in those who have proven themselves to be trustworthy. Conversely, a lie is not just an isolated event. It rewrites your history in the eyes of others. Once you are caught lying, people will reinterpret your past actions through the lens of that deception, and they will start to wonder what else you concealed. That retrospective suspicion is corrosive, and it spreads quickly. In international relations, the cost of repairing that damage is immense, often exceeding the cost of the original offense many times over. Truth, then, is not just an ethical ideal, it's a strategic necessity. It's worth noting that truth in diplomacy is not about revealing everything. No nation, no leader, no individual tells every detail. That's neither realistic nor wise. But there is a profound difference between discretion and deception. Discretion is the art of knowing when and how to speak, while deception is the deliberate construction of falsehoods to manipulate others. Discretion protects trust, deception destroys it. If you're operating in good faith, you can hold back certain information without undermining the relationship because the other party knows you're not misleading them. But the moment deception enters, even legitimate discretion becomes suspect. This is how alliances unravel, not through the absence of information, but through the presence of falsehood. The fragility of truth is that it requires constant upkeep. You cannot tell the truth once and expect the matter to be settled forever. It must be maintained in every interaction, in every agreement, in every negotiation. And that is exhausting. Lying, ironically, is easier in the short term, which is why so many people choose it. But what they don't account for is the long-term cost. The mental strain of maintaining the lie, the emotional toll of constant vigilance against exposure, and the systemic damage it does to every relationship it touches. Truth is harder initially, but it creates a stability that frees you from those burdens. This is why the discipline of truth-telling is not just moral training, it is psychological self-preservation. When a single individual abandons truth in a way that affects international trust, the ripple effects are enormous. It's not just that one person's credibility is destroyed, it's that their entire nation's word is suddenly less valuable. Allies begin to hedge their commitments, adversaries become bolder, and neutral parties start looking for alternatives. A single lie can shift the balance of alliances, disrupt trade flows, and even alter security arrangements. And the person responsible may not even fully understand the magnitude of what they've done until it's far too late. By then, the damage is embedded in the system, and undoing it is like trying to unring a bell, nearly impossible. The other side of this truth dynamic is that people often think they can contain the fallout. They believe that if they lie in a targeted way, it will affect only the specific issue at hand. But deception rarely stays in its lane. Once the trust in your word is compromised, suspicion bleeds into areas that had nothing to do with the original offense. Suddenly, even unrelated agreements become points of contention. Partners begin to delay, stall, or walk away from negotiations altogether. The loss of trust has a compounding effect, growing larger with each interaction. This is why experienced diplomats guard their credibility as fiercely as their military strength, because one is useless without the other. Truth also has a psychological dimension that cannot be ignored. People, whether they are individuals or entire nations, want to believe that they are engaging with an honest counterpart. That belief creates a sense of security, and security fosters cooperation. When you take that away, you create a climate of anxiety. Anxiety, in turn, breeds defensive behavior, and defensive behavior is the enemy of collaboration. In the absence of truth, fear fills the vacuum, and fear leads to withdrawal, suspicion, and ultimately conflict. This is why dishonesty doesn't just damage specific agreements, it damages the entire emotional climate in which those agreements are made. What's remarkable is that truth doesn't just protect relationships, it strengthens them over time. When two nations navigate challenges together honestly, they develop a deeper resilience. They learn that even when interests diverge, they can work through it without resorting to deceit. That mutual confidence becomes a form of capital, not financial, but relational, that can be drawn upon in times of crisis. And that capital is irreplaceable. You cannot buy it, you cannot fake it, and once you've squandered it, you cannot easily rebuild it. This is why truth is both a shield and a sword in diplomacy. It defends you from suspicion and equips you to face challenges more effectively. In the end, truth is not just about morality, not just about philosophy. It's about survival. Without it, the most sophisticated systems collapse under their own weight. With it, even fragile alliances can endure the most severe pressures. And when one person chooses to abandon truth, they are not just breaking a rule, they are pulling bricks out of the foundation of the entire structure. The higher that structure, the greater the fall. The stakes are not abstract. They are real, and they are enormous, and they are determined in many cases by the simplest of all decisions to tell the truth or not. Order is slow, chaos is fast. It can take decades of effort, negotiation, and careful relationship building to create a functioning alliance between nations. That process involves thousands of interactions, layers of trust, and countless small decisions made correctly. Yet all of that stability can be undone in a shockingly short time by a single act of recklessness or malice. This is the asymmetry between order and chaos. Creation is painstaking, destruction is instantaneous. It's far easier to topple a structure than to build one, and that's why betrayal in diplomacy is so dangerous. One reckless act can create a diplomatic earthquake that shakes the entire foundation. And once the aftershocks begin, they can continue for years, even decades after the initial event. The speed of chaos gives it an unfair advantage over order, but it's not an advantage that exists by magic. It exists because humans are wired to respond more strongly to threats than to stability. If an alliance is functioning well, it becomes background noise. People stop paying attention to the steady hum of cooperation because it doesn't demand urgency. But the moment something goes wrong, it floods our attention. Panic spreads, narratives change, and suspicion multiplies. That's why it only takes one negative event to undo years of quiet progress. We are biologically primed to react to bad news faster and more decisively than to good news. And in diplomacy, that instinct often turns a single bad decision into a chain reaction of escalating distrust. Consider the architecture of an alliance like the construction of a bridge. Every beam, every bolt, every joint must be carefully placed according to a plan. The bridge is strong, but only as strong as its weakest part. Now imagine one person loosening a single bolt in a key structural point, whether through negligence or intent. For a while, nothing seems to change. But eventually, stress accumulates in that weakened spot, and when it fails, the collapse is sudden and catastrophic. That is how chaos works in international relations. The point of failure may be small in scale, but the consequences are massive because the system relies on everything holding together. What's worse is that chaos doesn't stop with the initial damage. Once trust is broken, the void it leaves behind invites opportunism. Rival nations see an opening and exploit it. Allies begin to reconsider their commitments. Negotiators grow cautious, slowing down or abandoning progress altogether. The disruption spreads outward, infecting areas of cooperation that had nothing to do with the original incident. This is why one moment of dishonesty or incompetence can feel like a contagion in international politics. Because the relationships are interconnected. A failure in one area often undermines confidence in others, even if they were functioning perfectly before. The nature of chaos is that it often escalates beyond the control of the person who started it. That's the irony. The individual whose decision causes the collapse rarely has the power to repair it. They may have acted for short-term gain, thinking the fallout could be managed, but once the wheels of mistrust are set in motion, they gather momentum. Leaders, diplomats, and institutions are then forced to devote enormous resources to damage control, often at the expense of other priorities. And the sad truth is that even when some of the lost trust is rebuilt, the memory of the betrayal remains, making the repaired relationship more fragile than before. Part of the challenge is that order requires shared rules, but chaos only needs one participant to stop following them. You can have 99 honest actors in the system, all working with integrity, and one person's breach can still compromise the whole arrangement. This is the asymmetry that makes trust so vulnerable. The maintenance of order is a collective effort, but the creation of chaos can be a solitary act. This reality should be sobering to anyone who operates in a position where their choices affect not just their own reputation, but the stability of larger systems. One person can act as a gatekeeper to stability or as the spark that lights a political wildfire. The other insidious quality of chaos is that it changes how people think about risk. Once a betrayal or a major breakdown occurs, even the most cooperative partners start planning for worst-case scenarios. They become less willing to take chances, less open to compromise, and more inclined toward defensive posturing. In diplomacy, this often means moving from engagement toward disengagement, from openness toward secrecy, from partnership toward rivalry. And these shifts, once they take hold, are hard to reverse. People remember being burned. They adjust their behavior to ensure it never happens again, sometimes to the detriment of relationships that could have recovered under different circumstances. In systems like international relations, stability is never the default state. It is the product of constant, active maintenance. That means even in times of peace and prosperity, the work of sustaining cooperation is ongoing. You don't get to build an alliance once and then walk away. You have to reinforce it at every stage. But chaos doesn't play by the same rules. It doesn't need constant attention. It just needs one moment of opportunity. That's why one act of sabotage, intentional or otherwise, can be disproportionately destructive compared to the thousands of acts of good faith that came before it. The game is unfair, and the only way to win is to acknowledge that imbalance and guard against it. One of the most dangerous lies people tell themselves is that chaos can be contained, that you can engage in one small act of dishonesty or one breach of protocol without it spilling over into other areas. But systems are interconnected in ways that are not always visible. A single incident can influence how every future decision is interpreted, coloring perceptions in unrelated domains. Containment is an illusion. Once chaos enters the system, it interacts with every other component, sometimes in unpredictable ways, until the stability you thought was isolated from the problem begins to unravel. This is why the stakes are so high for every individual operating in such environments. Ultimately, the speed and scope of chaos are what make it so dangerous. It moves quickly, spreads widely, and leaves deep scars. Order, on the other hand, is slow, deliberate, and fragile. This means that the responsibility for maintaining order lies heavily on the shoulders of everyone involved, from the highest ranking officials to the lowest level functionaries. If even one of those shoulders shrugs off that responsibility, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. And once it falls, rebuilding it is not a matter of days or weeks, but of years, if it can be rebuilt at all. People like to tell themselves they don't matter. They imagine their lives as small, their choices insignificant, their influence negligible. It's a comforting story because it relieves them of responsibility. If nothing you do truly matters, then you're free to act however you please without worrying about consequences. But that is a dangerous delusion. In reality, every decision you make participates in a chain of events that extends far beyond your immediate sight. You are tied into networks, social, political, economic, that respond to your behavior in ways you may never see. This is true for individuals in their personal lives, and it's just as true in the domain of international relations. One person's actions can create ripples large enough to reach distant shores. History offers endless examples of this phenomenon. A single whistleblower can shift public opinion and change the policy of nations. A solitary act of corruption can poison diplomatic trust and derail trade agreements worth billions. One unguarded statement, made in the wrong room at the wrong time, can ignite years of hostility. These events are not anomalies, they are the natural consequence of how systems work. Large systems are sensitive to key points of leverage, and individuals often sit right at those points without realizing it. This means that the influence you wield is not just a matter of your position, but of the context in which you act. The wrong action at the wrong moment can have an outsized impact. The uncomfortable truth is that your potential for destruction is matched by your potential for restoration. Just as one individual can erode trust between nations, another can be the catalyst for rebuilding it. But that requires an understanding of the weight you carry, a willingness to see yourself as part of something larger. Too many people operate as if they exist in isolation, as if the consequences of their actions evaporate at the edge of their personal lives. That's not how reality works. Every act of integrity strengthens the network you're in. Every act of deceit weakens it. And because trust compounds over time, both for good and for ill, your role in that process is far more significant than you might want to believe. People often hide from this truth by appealing to scale. They'll say, "What difference could I possibly make in a system so massive?" But that's not how influence works. Influence is not evenly distributed. It's concentrated in moments, decisions, and positions of vulnerability. The idea that only leaders shape history ignores the reality that leaders act on information, and that information often comes from people at much lower levels. A border official deciding whether to allow a shipment through, a translator choosing how to phrase a sentence, a mid-level manager setting the tone for negotiations. These are all points where an individual can steer the course of events. Scale doesn't erase your influence. It disguises it. Part of the problem is that people underestimate the fragility of trust. They think it takes something massive, a war, a political coup, a complete economic collapse, to alter the trajectory of relations between nations. But sometimes it's one seemingly small betrayal that starts the shift. And once that trust is gone, the gap it leaves is often filled with suspicion, which is far harder to dislodge. This is why the claim, "I'm just one person, what can I do?" is not just false, it's dangerously naive. One person can do more than they realize, often in ways that are irreversible. That should be a warning, but it should also be a call to take your role seriously. This dynamic is not purely destructive. The same principle applies in the positive direction. One act of courage can inspire confidence, one display of fairness can rebuild dialogue, one unexpected show of honesty can reopen stalled negotiations. These moments rarely come with advance warning. You won't always know when the decision in front of you is the one that will matter most. That's why living as if every decision matters is the safest approach. If you train yourself to act with integrity consistently, you're prepared for those moments when the stakes turn out to be higher than you expected. You can't wait for the big moment to start acting responsibly. By then, it's too late to change your habits. The challenge, of course, is that responsibility is heavy. It's easier to pretend you don't have it. It's easier to believe the lie that you're insignificant. But the truth is that the weight is there whether you acknowledge it or not. Choosing not to see it doesn't make it disappear, it just makes you more likely to misuse it. People fear responsibility because it demands discipline. It demands the courage to resist self-interest when it conflicts with the greater good. It demands an awareness of the ripple effects your choices will create. And it demands the humility to admit that you have more influence than you might like to admit. What makes this even harder is that you don't always get feedback. Sometimes you make a choice that shapes events in profound ways, and you never find out about it. That can make responsibility feel abstract, like you're carrying a weight you can't see. But that invisibility doesn't reduce the reality of your impact. It just makes it harder to measure. This is why people who understand the stakes operate with a kind of quiet discipline. They know that unseen consequences are still consequences. They know that just because no one is watching doesn't mean the outcome doesn't matter. And they act accordingly, even when the temptation to cut corners is strong. It's also worth noting that the refusal to take responsibility is, in itself, a choice with consequences. When you tell yourself that your actions don't matter, you're not stepping out of the game. You're just letting other forces decide the outcome for you. In international relations, that often means leaving the field open for those who are less scrupulous, less honest, and more self-serving. Abdicating your role creates space for damage to occur. Inaction is not neutral, it is an active contribution to whatever result follows. This is why responsibility is not something you can opt out of. You either take it seriously and direct your influence towards stability, or you ignore it and allow instability to grow. Understanding your significance means accepting that you are not just a participant in history, you are a creator of it. The choices you make today, no matter how small they seem, will ripple outward into a future you may never see. Those ripples may merge with others, creating waves that shape the course of events in ways no one could have predicted. This is why integrity and responsibility are not luxuries, they are necessities. You cannot control every outcome, but you can control whether your contribution strengthens or weakens the systems you are part of. That control is both a privilege and a burden, and it belongs to you, whether you claim it or not.